Presenting 20 thinkers who have shaped our modern society.
Welcome back to 20 Thinkers, and today I'm joined by political thinker himself, Jacob Moore. How are you, Jacob?
Great, thanks, Hannah. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, as you might know, this is a show where we are joined by thinkers like yourself to get through what we have deemed the 20 landmark political thinkers who have shaped the modern society. Today we are looking at the very well-known and articulate liberal thinker, Milton Friedman, and another, liberal thinker from a different regard, John Rawls.
Yes, same word, a different connotation. I'm looking forward to breaking this down.
Absolutely, and I suppose that's a great in for me to ask you about your take on the differences between the two liberal perspectives from the two texts, Friedman's Introduction to Capitalism and Freedom and Rawls's Introduction to a Theory of Justice. For your context, Jacob, we invite our listeners to read these prior to listening to the program.
I'd be happy to. Firstly, just have a look at those titles. They really do a lot of this analysis for me. Friedman's two priorities, freedom and capitalism, and simply just justice for Rawls. These really are the foundational terms which underpin the differences between these perspectives. Both Friedman and Rawls both have a role for justice systems to be delivered by the state. It's one of the few things that they do agree on. Where they differ, however, is the extent and role of justice and interference with personal freedoms. The personal freedoms that Friedman holds to the highest order. Now, Rawls builds this argument around morality and fairness, taking aim at utilitarianism, which can be translated into a direct attack on Friedman's second core principle of capitalism. Utilitarianism and capitalism go hand in hand, because markets for Friedman, they're good at producing efficient outcomes, with no focus on distribution.
So, why can't Friedman's perspectives on freedom coexist with Rawls' views on distribution and justice?
Well, they don't go well together because Friedman believes that smaller government and less interference is always desirable. I mean, how can you levy heavy progressive taxes to support the bottom end of town without violating this principle of smaller government?
Well, that's right. The very idea of high taxes means a bigger tax department, more tax agents, and it just snowballs from there. And that's before you even consider the invasion of freedom, that Friedman would see a tax rate above 50%.
Exactly. Friedman's argument about freedom is in fact the most important here. A higher tax rate stops individuals from living out the life that their labour income could potentially buy and do without taxes. Taxes, which economic theory does support, are always distortionary in markets, unless they are lump sum, and thus reducing the efficiency of an economy and of output, thus limiting what markets can do for individuals and their freedom. This is what Friedman sees as a violation of personal freedom from the state.
But Jacob, isn't all of this talk of efficiency pointless if the bottom end of town is suffering? Shouldn't we be maximising their welfare before giving a single tax cut or concession to literally anyone else, like Rawls suggests?
Well, you basically hit Rawls' economic argument right on the head. But this political theory is based on the concept of justice. Justice for Rawls is paramount, and that fairness is something you agree to when you enter into the social contract, which always looks out for the little guy, aka the literal worst person's welfare. For our economist listeners, if we were to translate this political theory into a utility function, the utility of the least well-off person is the utility function of society.
Wow, okay, I'm really seeing what you mean about their different perspectives. Let's never leave those two blokes in the same room together with anything sharp. But look, I think we can go deeper into their differences, because there are many. What are their takes on centralisation of government?
Well, look, that's a really good question. They're very different. Although Rawls doesn't explicitly mention the size he thinks government should be, he does frequently mention social contract theory throughout his text. For listeners unaware, a social contract is an agreement you knowingly or, unknowingly engage in when you're born or move into a state. Without a state, we are in the state of nature, which, as your listeners will know, is the work of Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan. To hold justice so highly, a social contract is required, as it requires large government to administer looking out for the lowest members of society before others. We can imply from this that Rawls is happy to have very large government, so as long as it is able to satisfy the moral obligations of prioritising justice.
And so, what about Friedman?
Well, in the intro to Capitalism and Freedom, Friedman makes very clear that government should be as small as possible. This is so choice can be given to individuals in society to move into another district, county, province, whatever you feel like calling it. If you don't like anything about the one that you're in, just move, he reckons. It's basically like a perfectly competitive market for him, and the more products, or in this case local governments, the more choice, freedom, and maximum benefit individuals can obtain.
Well, that's interesting, because in that same intro, didn't Friedman deconstruct JFK's speech about collective responsibility?
Well, he did indeed, which highlighted Friedman's desire to have people regarded as individuals in society, not collectives. For the very same reason, he supports local rather than federal government power, so individuals can act independently and have personal choice as well as freedom.
So, what does Rawls have to say about individualism then?
Again, Anna hitting me with the very difficult questions here because he doesn't explicitly say. But if I was to extrapolate from his arguments about justice, I would say because a Rawlsian social welfare utility function values the lowest member of society as a utility function of the collective, the priority of individualism is low on the ladder of rankings. For Rawls, it is all about morality. Ensuring justice is a responsibility for all of us. So Rawls certainly can't be called an individualist.
Well, given that we are not all individuals on our own journey through life, and we tend to do things as human beings in households and within communities, how do these arguments relate to contemporary political problems here in Australia?
Well, it seems that there is a mixture of the two political ideologies at play here in Australia. Friedman's ideal world is one with no state intervention, or limited state intervention, but a large amount of individual freedoms. Whereas Rawls sees justice and maximising the utility of the least well-off Australian before anyone else as the way forward. Now, we clearly have a mix, an interesting mix at that, and I'll explain why. Australian governments clearly cater for the middle class a lot because of the Downsian theory of the median voter. It's simple politics that if you want to win elections, you can't always focus on justice for the least well-off member of society. It simply doesn't win you elections. But we know that some Australians like letting everyone have a fair go and to have justice as a safety net. So as long as it does not impede the freedoms on their own life journey too much, this might be okay. So we have a complicated tax and transfer system, like most of other developed nations, which tries to have a trade-off between economic efficiency that Friedman wants and a system that Rawls would approve of from an equity point of view, where society takes a role in supporting those who are unemployed and so on.
So, how do you think these two political thinkers have influenced political perceptions about an Australian issue like the New Start unemployment allowance?
Well, look, I won't try to pretend that these two political thinkers have influenced this debate directly, but Friedman has certainly championed the conservative way of thinking, and his arguments are used on repeat by conservative small government liberals all around the world. Rawls, on the other hand, also has this effect, driving a moral argument about what is right thing to do and tends to fuel an emotional debate about what people deserve as a human right on the left side of politics. In the New Start allowance debate, I tend to think that these political thinkers do fit in somehow in somewhere. Society wants justice and a fair safety net for those who are less fortunate than others. It's the morally right thing to do, right? The potentially sad reality is that the conservative ideology resonates with more than just staunch conservatives. We want morality and it's sort of justice for these people, so as long as it doesn't affect those who have their lives together, as long as tax rate to fund it does not affect the individual endeavours of households and the general middle class.
So you think Australians are happy for justice to prevail as a primary political idea, so long as it doesn't affect the individual freedoms which allow those who are not at the bottom to live their life relatively outside of the group of government? For example, without over 50% tax rates?
I do, and perhaps that's just my opinion, but from these two landmark thinkers, they really have shaped the centre-left and right sides of the political debate on things such as welfare size and role of government, and the ranking of philosophical ideas such as justice, freedom, and individualism.
And that is exactly why we have had these two thinkers on this program. They are landmark in how they are still so relevant in shaping the modern society that we find ourselves within.
Not only that, I find these two thinkers in particular push us to think and act within the world differently, making them, in my eyes, truly landmark thinkers.
How exactly do they push you to think and act within the world?
Well, we often get caught up in the rush of our own bubble. We can forget that although things are going right for ourselves, perhaps our welfare should be in some way collective, which draws on the elements from Rawls' high priority of social justice. He makes me wonder how I might see the world if I was the literal worst person off in society. Yet on the other hand, has society really tried the truly free market solution which Friedman proposes?
Well, not quite. Even though Friedman was influential during the Reagan-Thatcher years, his own ideology, recorded further into Capitalism and Freedom, concedes he is not the type of conservative, but they were through and through. Friedman was a true libertarian who cared less about traditional family values and other Thatcher-Reagan rhetoric, and more about true freedom.
Exactly. And so I don't think we will really ever see Friedman's dream of a truly free market economy and society, but it does provide me with a lens through which I can be critical of market societies.
How do you mean by that?
Well, Friedman was writing in an era before a lot of the negatives of this economic liberalisation surfaced. He was not around to answer for the global financial crisis, for example, which saw economies and societies crumble under the strain of economic free market policies. And so his arguments for truly small governments are perhaps unjustified at these extremes, especially since Rawls makes strong arguments for human compassion based on morality at a deeply human rights level.
Well, Jacob, luckily this is the podcast which explores 20 thinkers who have made the modern society, and we have more than just Friedman and Rawls to draw upon.
Exactly, and as I mentioned earlier, the society we live in today seems to be a mixture of the two plus many more, as the rest of this series will reveal.
Jacob, thank you for joining us today on the show. Until next time, everyone, keep thinking.